Thank you so much for having me today, and congratulations on everything you've done to end veteran and chronic homelessness. We're very, very excited that you're now focusing on families, me in particular, because I am looking forward to learning from you. My job today is a bit to set the stage about what it is that we've learned about family homelessness nationally, and some exciting things that are happening in localities that you may be able to borrow from. So, quickly, we know that about 65,000 families with children experience homelessness on any given night. About 1 in 10 individuals and families are in a place not intended for human habitation. So that's cars and campgrounds and outdoors and in subway stations. In January 2015, 20 children were found in the state of Connecticut in a place not suited for human habitation. Over the course of the school year, school liaisons identified 1.4 million school-aged children living either in shelter, unsheltered locations, transitional housing, or, and they include doubled-up situations, living in doubled-up situations. And about 77% of those families are in doubled-up as opposed to homeless service programs. So that probably underestimates the needs. We look at census data, and we found that people in poverty living in doubled-up situations is about 7 million. When we're looking at the school-age number, we're missing all the children most of the children under age 5 if they don't have an older sibling. So I think something that's important to just recognize is that most of these people living in doubled-up situations, most of the people who are evicted, most of the people who are precariously housed will never enter a homeless service program. Essentially, the homeless service programs are a bit of a safety net for a very bad housing market. So when families are forced out of a doubled-up situation, when that situation just becomes untenable, this is where they turn to. They turn to homeless shelter programs when there's no other really good choice. So who are the families who end up turning to homeless shelter programs? And when I use the word homeless, I'm always going to talk about those using the homeless service programs. They're mostly single parents. Parents are often young. We see in some cities that upwards of 50% of the families are headed by somebody under the age of 25. Half of the children in shelter nationally are age 5 or under, and we understand from research that infants are more likely to be homeless than toddlers, and toddlers more likely to be homeless than preschoolers. The risk of homelessness is higher the younger the child, and some researchers have identified the actual birth of the child in the early childhood as sort of being a precipitating event where a screaming baby is no longer welcome in an overcrowded, doubled-up situation. This is actually probably the most important research that has been done, I think, as far as policy implications and some practice implications for communities. So I want to spend a bit of time here. This is research done by Dennis Culhane about 10 years ago, but it's been retested and it tends to hold up. And what he did was he looked at data from 4 jurisdictions, from the state of Massachusetts, from New York City, from Philadelphia, and Columbus, Ohio. He looked at administrative data. They had very good data on homeless service systems. And what he found was that 72 to 80% of families using shelter or using homeless service programs did so once and left and did not have recurring homeless episodes. That's the vast majority of how folks experience homelessness families. There was this very small group he called episodic who churned. They became homeless, then they left, then they came back to shelter, then they left. They went to a motel, they went to an aunt's house. They were in constant churn. These families, and subsequent research found that these families also, the subset, have a lot of family instability as well as housing instability. So they never really stabilize at all. as they re-enter shelter, there's often a family member missing, or a new family member appeared, or a new partner. So these are the families in the greatest turmoil and instability. The long-term stayers, that's my phrase, were the ones who were spending maybe a year or more homeless. And these were the folks that we were spending most of our resources supporting. This is where the bulk of our homeless assistance resource goes. Even today, we're spending about $350 million supporting long-term transitional housing programs a year. So that raised some questions. So what he did next was he took a look at the available administrative data to see if there's differences between these subgroups. You know, were there anything different? Did these long-term stayers require transitional housing or require lengthier interventions before they were able to get back into housing? And he found that they didn't. Probably not surprising, he found necessarily. He found that the episodic homelessness group were more likely to have had a parent who was treated in an inpatient residential program for a mental health or substance abuse disability, and they were more likely to have a child removed from care. But by and large, looking at the data that he had available, there was very little difference between those who had a temporary short-term stay in homelessness and those who had a long-term stay. And in fact, in some other research we have found is that those programs actually often, generally, I'm not talking about every single program because there's differences, in general, they were sorting some of the families most likely to succeed because they applied entry requirements to get in and participant requirements to stay. So you had to comply with a certain set of expectations in order to stay in their program. A study by Gates Foundation, who invested a lot of money in transitional housing, did an evaluation of families who were asked to leave those programs and found that on almost every variable that they looked at, well, on every variable that they looked at, the families that were asked to leave were more vulnerable than those who stayed on to graduate. And that includes a parent with a mental health, substance abuse, or developmental disability, a parent with domestic violence, a parent with unemployment. So the consequence of this is really, and the consequence for policy, I think, and practitioners who care about making things better, is are we making the best use of these resources? Because the long-term stays were costing on average, well, I don't know what they cost on average. What they were costing in this study was upwards of $50,000 a year. And so was that the best use of those resources when $50,000 a year could provide that one family a housing subsidy for maybe 6 or 7 years, or they could provide 7 families a housing subsidy for a year. So it just raised a lot of questions about where we were spending the money and whether we could do something more equitably. And so could we instead maybe cash out some of the stuff that we're doing and provide mobile services for not only those families who we're already spending a lot of money for, but also maybe some of these other families who are sitting in shelter and they're working really hard to try and get out, but they're really not getting much more than shelter and the case management services that those programs provide. And what can we do better for these families? Because we're not serving these families well at all. They come into the shelter, and then they go out, and then they come back in, and they go out. They're not sticking to us long enough, so we're not really targeting them. So overall, could we do a better job if we realign our resources? So this actually happened around the time that rapid rehousing was growing in the country. It was getting more prominence. And so I know you're probably quite familiar with rapid rehousing, but let me just tell you the story of how I became familiar with it. Hennepin County, which is Minneapolis, has a right to shelter policy in that if a family appears and they lack shelter, they will make sure that that family has shelter for the night. That's not true in most places in the country. So what was happening in Minneapolis was that they were reaching a moment where all the shelters were full, all the motels were full. They had no resources or political will in order to build more shelter. So they were facing a winter where they were doing the graph, and they were like, this is what we're going to do here is we're facing a moment where we're going to have to start denying shelter. We have to come up with something else. And actually, I think this was quite innovative. What some of the policymakers there decided to do at the local level was, well, maybe what we can do is make the shelter beds turn over faster. Because what was happening in the homeless service system is that families were showing up, and individuals, this happens to, single folks as well, are sitting in shelter, and they are doing their darndest to get out of shelter. They don't want to live there. They're trying to get a job, they're trying to save up. Sometimes they're spending 3 to 4 months doing nothing more than job search, savings, and looking for a landlord in between their jobs that's willing to overlook whatever spotty credit history they have. And so what they decided to do was decided to create a package. So they contracted with shelter providers and others to work in the community to help the clients, to help the families, to help single adults, they do that too, get out of shelter by doing what they're already trying to do. So instead of having them wait 2 to 3 months to save up their own money, provide a grant of 2 to 3 months. Instead of having them do the housing search all by themselves, go out, negotiate with the landlords, follow the case management with them so that they have the support that they need to be successful. And to me, that was really why rapid rehousing was so important. It was not necessarily to minimize, well, that's important too, minimize the length of stay in homelessness, but to me that was a kind of a side bonus. The real benefit was being able to help all families who are in crisis to be very effective in doing that. So we've learned a lot about rapid rehousing. We know that rapid rehousing, most families don't re-enter homelessness after rapid rehousing incidents. We know that it costs less. We know that there's a lot of benefits to it. But what I wanted to do is just share a couple of slides from some localities who have presented either at our national conference or in recent webinars. Actually, all of these communities, we have webinars on our website that you're free to look through. So these are just highlights from other communities. This is Mercer County. This is Trenton, New Jersey. They have a very unique family homelessness system in New Jersey. The welfare office essentially pays for emergency shelter, transitional housing, and homelessness prevention. So they're the payer. They pay on a per diem night. So each night in transitional housing, they write a check to the provider. So they decided to experiment a few years ago with rapid rehousing, and they found that they were able to rapidly rehouse families at half the cost. And so they no longer provide transitional housing there. They're the only community that does. Most others retained some transitional housing for very targeted populations. They also saw some benefits to their TANF program. So they saw that all the families were on TANF. They saw that families left TANF sooner, they had increased employment income, and their recidivism rate was lower for families who were rapidly rehoused versus transitional housing. This is Spokane, Washington. I really like this because what you'll see is the blue, that's their investment in rapid rehousing. And what you'll see is in 2012, they served 631 families. This is a community that has unsheltered families and children and has a wait list for shelter. In 2014, they don't have that wait list for shelter anymore, and they're serving almost twice as many families because they're able to get that flow. They're turning over those beds. They're helping more families get into housing without any new dollars. So essentially, they're able to serve more people by just using their resources smarter. This is Houston. Houston's doing lots of cool things. But you'll also see in 2012, the point-in-time count, so the number of people who are homeless on any given day was 723. In 2014, it's 442. So that's largely, it's not because fewer families are showing up over the course of the year. It's just that they stay there for a shorter period of time, so the numbers go down. And this is Pierce County, Washington. Pierce County is another place where there was huge investment in temporary housing, in transitional housing. And so they did an analysis, and you'll see the cost per permanent housing they estimated was transitional housing was $25,000 per exit to permanent housing, whereas rapid rehousing was $8,000. So they concluded that they needed to ramp up their investment in rapid rehousing to serve more households in need. So this is the kind of calculation that communities are now doing locally. And it's realigning things. And I just also want to say that this isn't that a lot of communities are retaining transitional housing. A lot of communities are investing, are making strategic use of this, but they're having very careful considerations. There's it's with attention to the opportunity cost. In some situations, it may be more valuable to retain this. Some examples in Spokane, they've kept some transitional housing and made them function more like emergency shelter to deal with the pent-up need, so they turn over faster. Their transitional housing providers are also doing some of the rapid rehousing services, so they've switched. And one of the transitional housing programs is becoming much more specialized, serving a population of families, I believe it's there, who are child welfare involved. So it's very targeted, and it's using all harm reduction policies, so all voluntary services, and they're getting better outcomes targeting a needier subset of families than they did prior. So it's just a very strategic, when do we want to, when is there other benefits to doing this, even if the costs are going to be more, that folks are looking at. So so overall, this is how I see homeless services policies changing nationally and locally. Diversion versus prevention. Let me do this real quick. So one of the things we've learned about homelessness prevention is that what we traditionally, and I've been doing this work for a really long time, we used to believe that when you provided eviction assistance, you were preventing homelessness. When we thought we were doing landlord mediation, we were preventing the homeless episode. But what we found is that we were preventing housing loss probably, but very, very few families who are evicted, very, very few families who are doubled up will actually ever show up to shelter. And so I think one of the pivotal studies, I think one of the things where HUD just went, was during HPRP, where everybody was a homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing program, where there was a lot of money being spent on prevention. You could spend millions of dollars on prevention without necessarily reducing that little triangle of people who show up at shelter. New York City did this study where they randomly assigned some families to homelessness prevention assistance and some people to, nothing, usual care. And they found that they thought they were really successful. They thought this was great, this was pivotal, because they reduced in half the number of families that got the treatment who ended up going into shelter. But HUD got a little bit more interested in the other group, the control group. Only 1 in 10 of those families who did not get homelessness prevention assistance ended up in shelter. So essentially for every dollar you were, spending, or every $10 you were spending, only 1 actually went to averting a shelter stay. So communities that are still invested in doing homelessness prevention are trying to figure out how to be much more strategic, targeting the highest need, those most likely to look like they're going to enter in shelter. Sometimes it's not rocket science. Look at the demographics. Minnesota did this. They looked at the demographics of who was getting homelessness prevention assistance, and they looked at the demographics of who was showing up in shelter. They did not look like the same group of people. They weren't the same group of people. The other thing that folks are doing, and I think this is what you're doing in Connecticut, is making sure that there's more resources at the front door of the homeless shelter system. Sometimes folks are leaving a doubled-up situation because it's too stressful. Almost always they're leaving a doubled-up situation because it's too stressful. So what can be done to remediate that stress? What resources might they be able to? What mediation? What kind of help can be done? So more resources there. Increasing reliance on rapid rehousing. Downsize or reallocating transitional housing very strategically, and using permanent supportive housing and other permanent housing resources when it's absolutely necessary so that you can go to scale. Because we can't go to scale, unfortunately, because we're not getting the housing resources that we need. So this is the new framework, largely, that's, I think, pretty well accepted right now, with the majority getting rapid rehousing. We're seeing essentially what some communities are now doing is a progressive engagement approach, where they're trying rapid rehousing first, maybe trying rapid rehousing a second time, and providing housing assistance and permanent supportive housing to those families who demonstrably could not succeed. But sometimes we can tell pretty much at the front door who's going to need it. I think I'm going to have to actually run through some things here. So I have like 5 minutes, right? About 5. So I think that the part of this conversation that I'm neglecting now, which I hope we can kind of cover more in the question and answer, is the role of state and local partners. I think the most important thing for us to think about is that homeless, and I can't even tell you how much of a battle this has been for me nationally. These are all of our families, right? You know, homelessness is not a trait, as one researcher says, Beth Shin. It's a state that people go through, right? And it's too many of your people go through it in the TANF world, in the child welfare world, in the early childhood, in your public schools. And so we need to understand how homeless families are interacting with our various service sectors. We need to figure out how to collaborate and share resources, and we need to collect and analyze data to improve targeting. I am going to jump to a couple things that I think, I'm going to make all this PowerPoint available to you, if anybody wants it. TANF agencies has been a particular passion of mine, so I want to spend some time with that. Nationally, about 41% of families who are homeless are actually getting TANF assistance. That means that, 59% are not. And this is money dedicated to helping improve the self-sufficiency of families. So I think that TANF agencies belong at the table, and they need to be thinking about how they're using their resources to support families. There's some low-cost ways of doing that. You can facilitate enrollment. In Cincinnati, for a while there, they were actually able to provide families in crisis benefits the same day they applied if they were in crisis. You can modify the work requirements so that families can retain the housing. You can coordinate with homeless service providers to improve housing and employment outcomes and support or lead efforts to rehouse families. And some quick pieces. The California Housing Support Program in California is $35 million dedicated by the TANF, that's the TANF agencies are receiving, to provide rapid rehousing to families experiencing homelessness. It's in 40 counties across the country. In Los Angeles, they actually have TANF workers, and Los Angeles and San Francisco are actually keeping subsidized employment slots there so that families can get rapidly rehoused and connected to employment simultaneously. The Family Stabilization Program is actually another fairly low-cost way of doing it. Families who are in a crisis situation And they're defining crisis situation as mom's fleeing domestic violence, mom has a untreated or dad undertreated mental health or substance abuse disability, or is homeless, receives intensive case management. Their work requirements are waived. Instead, what they're getting from the TANF agency is help to resolve their crisis so that they can, and this is their words, not mine, so that they can have the stable platform they need to take advantage of the self-sufficiency services. So I think that, I'm sorry for being long-winded and not getting as much time, but I am going to move to question and answer, right? I'll keep talking though.
Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
Lisa?
Thanks very much for your presentation, Sharon. Could you speak for just a minute about what we've learned about the distinctions between the much larger group of families who are at risk of housing instability and of those families who are literally homeless?
I don't know that we know that much. The characteristics of families who actually become literally homeless, they are more likely to be younger than poor housed families. We don't, to be honest, we don't know that much about families who are doubled up or precariously housed. We know that there's a ton of them. We know that most poor families, I read from the Low Income Housing Coalition today, are paying more than 50% of their income for rent. So that's like almost all families. So how do homeless families look different? Again, they tend to be younger, they tend to be African American, or they're more likely to be African American, they have younger children, they tend to have less social support. High numbers of these young moms, when we're looking at young moms in particular, have been in child welfare themselves as a child. So a New York City study found 37% had some child welfare involvement as a child, and 20% of these young moms had been in foster care. And yeah.
Sorry, I just to add to that. Is it true that they also frequently have experienced homelessness as children?
You know, I don't know. I don't know that we know that. I think that people report that all the time. You know, I think that, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I wonder, how are you binding together the different organizations, and how are you helping them to allow them to communicate with each other and not invade any kind of HIPAA things and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't do any of that, so that all happens at the local level. I think that one way that it's done is the recognition that these are not the homeless service agency's families. They're also the TANF families. So they're already an intersection, and I think it's and I think when other partners are coming to the table and actually bringing some resources to bear, I think that they're figuring out the kind of the confidentiality issues. I think at coordinated entry, you can have people sign things at the mainstream agencies. You can have people sign things, but I'm not sure of all the logistics.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. If we were able to find funding for a diversion program, what would be your advice on how to target that resource most efficiently and effectively?
I mean, I think I would suggest you talk to people like Lisa in Connecticut. I think I think that we're looking. I think a lot of communities have been able to demonstrate some ability to reduce new entrants into homelessness by going to the wait list. I mean, so it's not going upstream. It's going to people calling you up and saying, I need shelter tonight. And it's doing the kind of the counseling and the mediation to see if there's anything else. Oh, I think that must be my sign.
No.
That, you know, what will it take to make that doubled up effort last a little longer? So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I wonder if you have any data on the number of families that have exhausted TFA benefits.
I don't. I know that this is interesting. You know, we don't look at this as closely as we should, but Washington State actually has the best data system integration anywhere, you know, where they have housing data and reentry data and homelessness data, and they all mix it up together to see where and one of the things that they looked at was dynamics of TANF use. You know, and what they found, not unlike what Dennis found with homeless folks, is that a large number of homeless TANF families use TANF quickly and exit. Some stay on there a long time, and some are intermittent users. And what he found was that the families who were hitting the time limit or what Washington found, were much more likely to enter homelessness than those. And I also know, because this was an area that I've done some policy work, that families with lengthy TANF histories are also much more likely to have disabilities that we've missed along the way, and we should be doing a better job of sort of looking for the red flags and investigating using SOAR models, for example, to see if we can connect these parents to SSI quickly. It's a bit of a disservice to keep families on a program for 5 years, you know, and then leave them to the homeless service system. So, yeah, I think I'm talking to the choir there. But, yeah, so we need to do more there.
What methodologies have communities used to be really strategic about what transitional programs should be retained and what ones should be phased out?
You know, I think that some places are looking at things like permanent housing exits and the cost. So they're looking at that hard data, but I think part of it is also a values conversation, right? So, you know, we looked at the research and you know, found 3 discrete populations where you may want to retain long-term congregate transitional housing. There may be other models you want to retain, and that was for some people who are trying to, you know, choose to want that residential support to recover or reduce their substance use. Another group that I've heard that we didn't identify actually is families who were being reunified with children who didn't feel prepared. Now some did. Some are like, yes, I need housing and I'm back. But there were some parents, I've been told, that said, you know, I'm afraid. You're right. They're afraid. They're worried that they're going to mess up, and they want some backup support. So you know, it's a bit of a conversation. Where is this valuable resource? If you own the building, where's the best use of this resource? We could have shorter stays and help people, you know, move back into housing quicker. We could serve a different population, introduce some ideas like harm reduction and voluntary services to see if we can reach down to a more vulnerable population. It's a bit of a mix, though. It's not like, you know, choose this population. Young youth, homeless youth in particular, who may need that.
I had a question about doubling up of households is usually poor people taking in poorer people.
Yes.
Desperate people taking in even more desperate people. So, you know, if somebody's middle class, upper middle class has some resources and they say, you know, I care about this, I'd like to help people out. It's not easy to figure out how to do that. You know, you might have an extra couple of bedrooms that you'd be willing to help people out. I don't know what it would take to mix this up a little bit and try to see if there was a way to connect people. You'd obviously have to have people vetted somehow, and, you know, nobody's going to want to take a bed-bug-infested family, you know, that has a whole bunch of psychiatric instability into their home. But it seems like unless you can get people helping people and reaching across those quote-unquote class barriers, you're not going to get very far.
Yeah, there's actually a model that I'm just really intrigued with, largely coming from the families world and still in a learning about youth world, called host homes, that seems to be quite popular, where it is models where they're taking in youth or maybe a young mother with a young child into their home, and there's case management being delivered, and sometimes that host family receives a small stipend, maybe not always. It's been used, I think, also with LGBT youth who want more of a, an accepting community, and sometimes a congregate model of transitional housing isn't well suited for a youth, and so it provides perhaps a more nurturing. It seems a little scary, right, because it's a person in a stranger's home, but it's evidently been used in the youth world for a while.
Okay, so we have time for one more question.
My question is about fathers or mothers returning from incarceration who often have very limited housing opportunities and live with folks but are pretty much at the will of someone throwing them out when they're ready to. Where do they fit into the statistics, and what are you hearing nationally regarding that population?
I don't know the statistics. I know that the reentry population have huge housing barriers. My sense of things, not being an expert in this area, is that they probably romanticize the reception they're going to get from home, and often it's not so smooth as they hoped it would be. I think that there's a lot of attention. I actually heard Hillary Clinton speaking about it yesterday. I see that the Low-Income Housing Coalition is doing a campaign this week to really draw attention to it. It's something I think we actually absolutely have to be on the cusp of as communities are looking and states are looking at downsizing their prison population, that they have housing opportunities. Alameda, I know that California put some money into providing essentially the rapid rehousing intervention, but hopefully not from homelessness, but actually from the correction facility to help negotiate housing placements for people returning as California is downsizing their prisons. So the homeless service system is getting money from the corrections department to do some of the rehousing assistance. Okay, thank you.
Good morning. How nice to be in Connecticut with such a wonderful group of colleagues and friends who care about family homelessness. I'm pleased to provide some introductory remarks for our next speaker, Kathryn Parr, known to us as Kate. Kate is going to summarize some interim findings from the Connecticut Costs of Estimating Child Homelessness Initiative, fondly referred to by us as CACHI. The CACHI's main partners are the University of Connecticut, the Partnership for Strong Communities, the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, and now Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, where I live, and I was going to say reside. That might be sort of true. The genesis of this work was a set of conversations in this very building about the need for us to really examine the costs of homelessness in a comprehensive way so that we could not just make compelling arguments for different kinds of interventions, but so that we can really understand in a very concrete way how prevention might make a difference. Similar to Sharon's framing of the different subtypes of families and how they might present at different times in different ways to these systems, we need not only to understand the cost, but to understand the cost of interventions and the cost of interventions that might eventually, for us to eventually be able to match interventions more specifically to family assets and needs. So this distinguished panel of guests here today that you're going to hear are going to talk about different parts of this. And it will be very instructive, but this is just the beginning of what we hope will be a longer dialogue. To end family homelessness, clearly we need to prevent family homelessness, and we need to divert family homelessness. And that will require a multi-pronged and a structural approach. So Dr. Parr will go into, these are no back of the envelope calculations. She's going to give you a very quick overview of some deep work that we undertook to understand the costs of child and family homelessness. This is the first couple of phases that are part of some work being done in Connecticut as part of a federal housing and child welfare demonstration. Connecticut is one of 5 national sites to be looking very carefully at the cost-benefit ratio for providing intensive services for families with very high service needs and long histories of housing instability and homelessness. Kate is part of a team and leads up the team that will be looking at the economics of family homelessness within that federal demonstration. That demonstration and its sister demonstrations really upend decades-long practice in child welfare, which took essentially a carrot and stick approach. A housing voucher as a carrot for families who could be good enough and well enough and stable enough, and the stick of TPR and a sense of family impermanence. So what these initiatives seek to do is to provide housing as a platform for family intervention, essentially seeing housing as a way to shore up vulnerable families, to let them do the good work of trying to stabilize the other parts of their lives in the ways that we would all like to do, with a roof over our head and a very strong sense of our own futures. So we've made some wonderful strides in Connecticut, and this is because of lots of collaboration and partnership across many agencies. The Connecticut Department of Children and Families has done some incredible national leadership work on this, putting housing very, very much in the center of their look at these the families living at the very ends of and the margins of our culture. And so I'm delighted to introduce Kate Parr, who hails originally from Canada. She received her bachelor's and her master's there, her bachelor's in economics and public policy at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm sure she's not the only Husky in the room. She got her doctorate in economics at the University of Connecticut. Her work does more than capitalize on the use of administrative data to understand how we might better improve our capacity to help vulnerable families. She's really been on the edge of pushing us as a state and working closely with the Office of Policy and Management to think about how we can link and use administrative data in innovative ways to understand and to do better the work that we all care so deeply about. So please join me in welcoming and thanking Dr. Kate Parr.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today. And thank you, Anne, for the great introduction there. And also, I want to thank the Partnership for Strong Communities and the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness for supporting us in this work. And as Anne has explained, this is really a multi-pronged approach, and we called it preliminary because this is really the first cut of, trying to look at these issues in Connecticut. So I briefly want to acknowledge the people who have helped and contributed with this. We've had partners, and mentioned some of them, but also the Urban Institute is doing the multi-site evaluation for the demonstration project. And they have been really instrumental in helping in terms of developing shelter costs for us. And then we also had assistance from UConn and CCH. So thanks to everyone. And some of this is going to be a little bit repetitive, so I'm going to go through it as quickly as I can. But I think, it's important to remember that, these are families that are at risk. A lot of low-income families are really one major event away from an episode that can trigger homelessness for them. And also that these homeless families touch a lot of systems. So they're facing issues, mental health and substance abuse issues related to trauma exposure over time. Children experience disrupted education. There's fractured social supports. And also, poverty is obviously a huge issue. And with respect to Connecticut, I know Sharon had some great cost information, but I think if we look at, we've all kind of seen this before, but these are the updated numbers, that the fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Connecticut on average is over $1,200. So that is well out of the range of affordability for most of these families. In Stamford, Norwalk, it's over $1,900, and the low in Wyndham is $953. In order to sustain that, many of these families, about 92% of these families, are single female-headed households, and it would take an hourly wage of $24.54 working full-time in order to reach the usual threshold that we kind of benchmark this with, is a 30% rent burden. So that's obviously well above what many of these families are going to be able to earn. It's certainly well above the minimum wage rate in Connecticut. So while housing obviously is expensive, I think what this presentation shows is that homelessness is really more expensive. These families touch a lot of systems, and this analysis looked at it had two different components to it. The first was to look at the estimate of shelter costs, and this was something where we dug down in Connecticut. We did 3 site visits. We also did a survey of family shelters in the state to ask information about detailed costs, the numbers served, the services offered, and really tried to profile these shelters. So that was sort of the big contribution, and that's something that's going to be a big part of the national demonstration project. And actually, Connecticut was the pilot for doing that in collaboration with Urban. The other piece that we wanted to look at was based on some work that was done by Perlman and Willard, and that was a Pennsylvania study looking at the cost of homelessness for children. And that study, essentially what they did is a literature review, and the methodology was to look at how many children are homelessness. They focus on children. How many children experience homelessness? What percentage of them are affected differentially by a number of issues, such as physical health, mental health, and other issues, and then looked at attaching a cost to that. So what we did is we replicated, in some sense, that same approach, and what we did is try to update the literature and also include Connecticut-specific costs. So I know we had this conversation earlier, but obviously it bears repeating. We used the Homelessness Management Information System as the backbone for our analysis. So those are families who were sheltered, who only showed up in the shelter system, and so we knew this gave us information on children, it gave us information on families, and it also gave us information of length of stay. The other 2 major sources, the point in time calculates, it's a one-night snapshot, so with HMIS we were able to take a full year, but it also captured sheltered as well as unsheltered. The McKinney-Vento data that's collected, which was also referenced, really gives us a sense of what we're missing when we look at just HMIS. So as many as 72% of children are not being captured in the HMIS service. So people who are unsheltered, who are doubled up, who have motel stays, their costs are not included in the study. So it's, this is some of the limitations of what we're doing, that we need to understand that this is a relatively conservative estimate. So I'm going to move into the shelter survey findings. This was, just to go straight to it, this is basically what we found. We had 13 overall responses, and we found kind of a bimodal distribution. So we had some really low-cost shelters, some really high-cost shelters, and the difference between the two really relates to what types of services are they offering. So there are shelters that literally, it's essentially a room and some beds, and then there are shelters that really have wraparound services. So they have, they'll have parenting coaches available. They have some child support in terms of, they have early childhood interventions locally. They have some child care. So they'll have a variety of wraparound services. But the average in the state was $55.87 per night per bed. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting about that for us is that we also asked the shelters what they thought it cost. And the shelter's average cost estimate was $32.81 a night. So that's, I think that tells us that we maybe need to reshift the conversation to think about, when we talk about the cost of a shelter night, what are the real costs? Because the range from the shelter providers was $12.50 to $60 per night was their guess. So it's all kind of skewed down in terms of what they think is actually costing to provide these services. Some of the other things we asked about, I'll go over this briefly, but we asked about sort of resources, what they thought the state needed in terms of, to try to improve the system. Probably the number one thing was the inadequate funding for targeted services to stabilize homeless families. So they really felt that there's not enough funding to really do what they want to do. They also reported issues around too few employment opportunities for these families. A lot of the issues that build into that, like a lack of childcare, a lack of transportation, and they also cited a lack of parent training and education. So it really gave a picture of families who want to work, who want to get stable, who want to earn their own way, but really there's just not enough available for these families out there. So moving to the second half of the study, this is where we did the literature review and we did some economic modeling. And we looked at several domains. So we looked at physical health and behavioral health, child welfare, and education, as well as some lifetime costs. And typically, the types of things that we see in the literature are studies that show that families and children use ED more frequently and more likely to have that as their usual source of care. There's also higher rates of chronic conditions among both children and adults. So for children, things like asthma or nutritional deficiencies like anemia. For adults, just cardiovascular disease, COPD. There were a number of conditions that they're more likely to have than what we were comparing them to was other low-income families. And, looking at the literature, some of the things that people said is that really, particularly for mothers, getting health care for themselves was a low priority. So these types of conditions or simple conditions like a common cold could elevate into something that's much more severe and require more health care than, if they had perhaps less going on in their lives. In terms of behavioral health, mothers and children both have high needs oftentimes, but is what the literature reports. Particularly one of the key themes is related to trauma exposure. And one study found that homeless children were, about 83% of homeless children were likely to have been exposed to at least one serious violent event by the age of 12. Mothers have often experienced sexual or physical abuse. And the result is that children often have high rates of anxiety and depression, as well as exhibiting externalizing behaviors. And the estimate we used was that they're about 15% more likely to need mental health services than their peers. Homeless mothers have high rates of PTSD, and one study actually went into a shelter in LA and kind of did an assessment of mothers there, and they found that about 72% of mothers had exhibited symptoms that might sort of suggest that they needed mental health treatment, but only about 12% actually got treatment. So there are high rates of unmet need even with the service use that we included in the model. So child welfare, obviously, part of the national demonstration is going to look more closely at this. There's a lot of studies that have been out there. One of the classic ones is that about 30% of folks in DCF care have a housing need. We didn't use that. We used a more conservative estimate that was really related to, it was a prospective follow-up study of homeless families in New York, and they found that 15% of children would receive a foster care placement within 3 years of a shelter stay. Now this is something we're interested in looking at because we know that Connecticut, the model of DCF care, has really tried to shift towards kinship care and alternate types of placements. So I think this is something that will be coming out of the demonstration project that we might have a better handle on. Someone asked about this earlier. standard statistic is that about 44% of mothers homeless today lived outside their homes during childcare during their childhood, and 20% were placed in foster care. So there is an intergenerational linkage between what happens as a child and the exposure to the homelessness experience and what happens as an adult. For education costs, we focused in on two different sets of costs. The first was the increased need for early intervention services for young children, and also increased use of special education services once they hit kind of K through 8. We also looked at the McKinney-Vento requirements around transportation for families to try to maintain the child in its current school, and also there are other mandated services and grants that the state receives to provide those services in the state. The other thing that relates to this, and I'm just going to talk about it in a minute, is this idea of lifetime costs. So we don't have a good estimate of this. This is really kind of a minimal estimate, but we know that children who experience this trauma, who fall behind in school, are less likely to graduate from high school. They're more likely to be incarcerated as adults, and they're more likely to be homeless. So trying to stick with what we know, this is census data looking at, basically this is the driver for lifetime earnings in the state, and we see that about 46% of people who have less than high school are either not in the labor force or unemployed, and that's about 1.5 times of people who have a high school diploma. Now, it's also worth noting that these figures are actually relatively high in Connecticut because our economy is really a high skill economy, and that's who's looking for jobs. So this really reflects a lack of economic opportunity for people who don't have the kind of educational attainment that we'd like. So getting to the total costs of homelessness, this is a breakout of what we found. Obviously, there's a lot of numbers behind this particular graph. We looked at maternal health, child welfare, some of those things, as well as the shelter costs. But you can see the biggest piece of the pie here is really related to this kind of fiscal loss related to reduced productivity for folks who essentially aren't going to have the kind of educational attainment. They're not going to have the long-term earnings that we expect them to have. So they'll have a lot of lifetime lost wages, higher rates of incarceration. The fiscal loss I should speak about briefly. That's looking at issues related to essentially when your income's lower, you pay less taxes, you're less likely to own a home, so you contribute less to local taxes. And then what happens is you're also more likely to be reliant on public benefits. So there's kind of a net fiscal loss calculation that we do that looks at the difference in terms of what people would have contributed had they at least made high school, which again is a minimal criteria, as opposed to what actually happened for them. So that's kind of the chart, and the total cost based on calendar year 2015 was about $111,000, or sorry, $111 million. We'll get to the other one in a minute. So those are really significant costs when we think about that. And if we look at what does this cost mean compared to other costs, our estimate is about $33,000 per person, or $122,000 per family. Looking at Perlman and Willard, they didn't do the cost per family because they only estimated child homelessness costs. They found it to be about $40,000 per child. There's another study that was done in Hampton Roads, Virginia, that found per child about $20,000 to be the cost per child. I'm presenting these so you can kind of see a range of what people have found, and oftentimes the difference in the range is how complete is this. So the Koch study really focused in on education costs and lost productivity. These both included lost productivity, whereas Perlman and Willard looked more broadly at mental health and physical health and child welfare. So that's where the difference is. But you can see that what I'm telling you, although this number is very, very big, is not really out of alignment with what other people have found. Sharon mentioned the Culhane study. Their estimate was about $43,000 per family. And it was in part based on the Spellman study of the cost of first-time homelessness. These costs are per family, but they're related to just that experience of homelessness. So they don't include these lifetime costs. So that's where we're kind of seeing the difference between them. So it's not looking at lost productivity or what's going to happen to finances over time. So Sharon actually gave you a lot of really good numbers about some alternative interventions. But one of the things to just, in a very ballparky kind of way is to think about the cost of the average annual cost of a two-bedroom apartment is about $15,000. The cost of family homelessness is about $122,000 for the family. So, we can't afford homelessness, but maybe we can afford housing, is kind of the upshot. So next steps, we are diligently working away on the demonstration project, and we're really excited to have a number of partners in the state. We're going to be pulling actual data for the families who are in the program, and we'll be doing a data linkage across multiple systems. So we'll be looking at TANF, we'll be looking at education costs, hopefully. We'll be looking at DCF costs, Medicaid, really trying to get a full picture of what the costs are for families in the different arms of the trials. And again, this is a trial for families who are DCF involved, who have relatively high needs. So the process is ongoing. This is just kind of a preliminary snapshot of where we're going with this. So I open it up to any questions.
Hi, thank you. No one's mentioned the issue that we all struggle with people who have an eviction history already and those with poor credit.
In terms of the cost study, we didn't necessarily look at the cost of overcoming those barriers, but I think there is an increased literature around the importance of providing financial education to these families so that they can begin to develop a credit history and they can begin to develop savings. Unfortunately, that's something you want to start, before they hit the homelessness period, and you want to look at in a preventive kind of a way. So I think your point is well taken. I think the rapid rehousing model can be very useful in terms of the state or programs providing some of the initial sort of paying down some of the debt that they may have so that they can get their utilities hooked up, as well as sort of guaranteeing the first couple of months of rent. But I think that is definitely something that needs to be worked out on a programmatic level. And I've mentioned the rent in here really for a comparison, just to think of the numbers. I'm not naive in the sense that, they could just go out and get an apartment if only they had the money. There is a lot more involved.
Thanks very much to everybody for being here. We're going to move to the second part of this event, which is a discussion with our panelists who represent state agencies, and we also have a representative here today of one of our family homeless service providers. You do have their bios, and just very briefly, I've been asked to go through and talk a little bit about what each of our panelists provides in the way of services for homeless families. Commissioner Yvonne Klein from the Connecticut Department of Housing, thank you very much for being here. Under Governor Malloy's tenure, we have successfully seen in Connecticut the reversal of 3 successive administrations' disinvestment in affordable housing. Commissioner Klein's leadership, we have seen more than 14,000 units of affordable housing built or rehabilitated. In addition to that, the Department of Housing is a key partner with our homeless service providers in funding coordinated access to homeless resources across the state, and the Department of Housing as well as the key funder for emergency shelter and rapid rehousing programs across the state. Commissioner Myra Jones-Taylor from the Office of Early Childhood. The Commissioner is responsible not only for the Care for Kids subsidy for child care, which of course is a critical component of support for the families that we work with, but she is also responsible for child development and early education programs and a host of family support programs for families at risk and homeless. Kate McAvoy. Thank you for being with us to represent our Department of Social Services. Among the programs that we would like to target on in terms of homeless families, of course, are SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, Husky, our state Medicaid and Children's Health Insurance Program, and TANF, financial supports in terms of temporary assistance to needy families. Elizabeth Duryea from the Department of Children and Families. Of course, DCF has a number of interests in terms of families who are facing housing instability and homelessness, but among the key programs provided by DCF are permanent housing and intensive case management for DCF families, including those where there would be the removal of a child due to housing instability or homelessness. ISHIF, the Intensive Supportive Housing Program, which we heard a little bit about during Kate's presentation, is a pilot specifically targeted to families in the DCF realm, but also who face severe housing instability issues. And DCF also provides the START program, an array of housing and support services for youth, including parenting youth in the ages of 16 to 24. Carla Miklos, at the end of the table, is the Executive Director of Operation Hope. Her shelter provides not only emergency shelter, but shelter diversion efforts, which we heard from Sharon about how important those efforts at the front door to help families resolve homelessness, how important those efforts are. But Carla also provides rapid rehousing and supportive services for families in permanent supportive housing. So what we'd like to ask of our panelists today is that each spend about 10 minutes. And in addition to talking about the programs that your agencies provide, we'd really like you to respond to a couple of the challenges we feel are before us. Further to Kate's research, we've seen that homelessness among families is not only a tragedy, but it's also very costly. At the cost of $122,000 a year per family, it seems to us that there is considerable rationale to do what we've done in other areas of homelessness, and that is to really target efforts on families who are literally homeless. So one question we'd like you to respond to is how can our state agencies work to target resources to this vulnerable and high-cost group of families? And the other question that is on the minds of no doubt everyone in this room is how do we do this work successfully in this era of rather extraordinary fiscal challenge in the state of Connecticut? That's, we think, the elephant in the room, but we'd like to call it out and ask you to respond so that we can all think together about these challenges. With that, Commissioner Klein, if you would start.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here again. So lots of good thinking, lots of good work, and thank you so much for presenting your information to us today. But I'd like to thank the partnership for their leadership in advocacy and education, and these IForums have truly proven to be valuable for all of us. It's always exciting to have the opportunity to highlight what we're doing in Connecticut to prevent and end homelessness, and it's because of so many of the folks in the audience today and so many of you up here that we're certainly where we are today in being recognized as a national leader in preventing and ending homelessness, as well as our creation, rehabilitation, and preservation of affordable housing across the state of Connecticut. So I have some general remarks to respond to what folks have brought out today, what you have asked us to present today in terms of our programs, and then I'll talk a little bit about what the questions that you've asked us to respond to as well. So what we know is that we can accomplish great things when we all work together for a common goal. And I often say, without Governor Malloy's leadership and commitment to not only end homelessness, but also to create affordable housing, we wouldn't be where we are today in the state of Connecticut. because he recognizes that breaking down the silos of state government allows us to achieve our common goals more effectively and more efficiently. I think many of us in the room, I don't want to date anybody, remember a state government that just operated in silos, and it was very difficult to move sort of a project forward because so many state entities, so many state agencies were involved. So today we've seen something totally different in the state of Connecticut. So all of the critical work that was done with the goal of ending veteran homelessness not only set us on the path to be the first state in the nation to end chronic veteran homelessness and the second state in the nation to effectively end veteran homelessness, but also to establish a well-developed system to address all individuals and families who are homeless. And I'm speaking very broadly here. Many of you know we have in Connecticut changed the way we address homelessness. You also know that we are a housing-first state. And as I mentioned earlier, we have broken down the silos of state government. But that's not all. We're working together with federal agencies and local providers to quickly identify and move individuals and families into permanent housing. It's because of our partnerships and our coordinated access network system that we are no longer managing homelessness. We are exiting individuals and families from homelessness, which is really key in the work that's being done. So I'd like to talk about some of the things we are doing today to end specifically family homelessness. Through our coordinated access network system, our families are assessed more effectively than in the past. We see providers like New Reach building on that in bundling state funding with other funds to hire a navigator to work with families who are on the shelter wait list, and they have significantly reduced that wait list. The end result, success in housing families, diverting some families to other resources, and for some, prioritizing them on the shelter wait list. And these were all themes that we heard from our previous speakers. The partnership the Department of Housing has formed with the Office of Early Childhood is an important one. We are working with them to get their contacts into family homeless shelters so children can be identified early and receive the services they need as early as possible. So I know we're all looking forward to the day when we can begin the process of closing shelters. But while we still need family shelters in Connecticut, we felt it important to address the physical conditions of those family shelters. The department has a funding round for capital improvements to shelters. This funding is to rehabilitate shelters to ensure teenage boys can stay with their families and to accommodate transgender youth. Rapid rehousing remains an important program for homeless families. As you know, rapid rehousing is HUD approved and an evidence-based form of intervention that works well for families. Typically what we see, and I think what we've heard today, is that the head of the household really can get employment and can stay for the most part employed after some sort of a turn of some bad times that they've had. But it's the rent that continues to be a challenge. So many of these families, once we get these folks employed and they stay employed, what we see with many of these families is that they're in this program on an average of 5 to 6 months. So we're having some good success with our rapid rehousing programs. Collaboration is also key with respect to rapid rehousing, and we have synced up the Secure Jobs program. So Secure Jobs is working with many of these families, connecting them with employment, leading to future success and security. And I would also note that the Department of Labor is a partner in this program. So, today you see the Department of Social Services with representation, DCF, OEC, the Department of Housing, DOL is a part, Department of Labor, the Department of Corrections is also a partner of ours. So, clearly we're all working together and overlapping where we could. in the southeast part of the state, because of their investment in diversion, another topic that we discussed and heard about earlier today, because of their investment in diversion and rapid rehousing, they have seen a decrease in the need for shelter beds and are looking forward actually to closing some of those shelters. So we're excited to hear that. The department continues to work with DCF on the provision of wraps for the family reunification programs and on other special projects. In addition, Connecticut, in concert with the Melville Charitable Trust and the National Alliance to End Homelessness, we are working to create a new service delivery model for rapid rehousing by using a modified critical time intervention model. We're excited to be, again, the first in the country to try this, and we hope that our experience will shape national policy in the future. So a couple of sort of off the topic of the programs, our support programs. Part of what we do at the Department of Housing is to provide funding to preserve, rehabilitate, and create affordable housing. So we're actually wrapping up our funding rounds for this fiscal year. So we are looking forward to, and we've received our state-sponsored housing portfolio applications for this funding round. Some of you are well familiar with all of this, and we look forward to, believe it or not, our last CHAMP round for the fiscal year, which is in June, and applications are due June 2nd, just as a reminder. So since 2011, with the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, we have preserved, rehabilitated, or created 7,665 units of affordable housing. We have over 2,800 units of affordable housing under construction and 5,200 units with funding commitments. So as Lisa mentioned, for 30 years, we have seen disinvestment in the creation of affordable housing, and since the governor has been elected, we've seen a commitment to fund the production of affordable housing. So overall, we are looking at, with CHAFA, a $1 billion investment, and which is an unprecedented funding commitment and production of affordable housing. So looking ahead, we're looking ahead to launching our Homeless Prevention and Response Fund, which is an innovative fund providing landlords with capital funding to make needed repairs on their properties in exchange for rental units to homeless or low-income individuals and families. We're also looking ahead to ending chronic homelessness by the end of this calendar year, and we are certainly on the cusp of doing that. On Thursday, the CHAFA board will consider a request to transfer funds from CHAFA to the Department of Housing to assist in rental assistance for 50 units of housing for the chronically homeless. And this is only one piece of our statewide initiative. So what you see here, and you're saying, well, CHAFA and funding, and what does all this mean? Well, we're doing, we're thinking about where there is funding. So to sort of address that question, what we're doing here and how do we make sure that we have the funding to achieve our goals? So we're looking at our different sister agencies, our quasis, who can be a part of this initiative and who could help us financially, and what sources of funds they do have to help. So by looking at things with a creative eye, from creative lenses, this is something that has come up. So we will also continue to quickly respond to the needs of Connecticut residents by having a department that is dedicated solely to housing programs and constructing housing. We have been able to pull together and focus on what is it that we need to do. And many of you have come in, you've met with us, you've shared your ideas, and your ideas have in essence appeared in many of what we do and how we've shaped what we do in the Department of Housing. So thank you for that. Clearly we will continue our development activities, and we will continue our partnerships with you as well as our sister agencies to achieve our goals in the state. So to wrap up, we've made great progress in the state of Connecticut, and we've developed a system where we are able to quickly identify and respond to the needs of our homeless individuals and families. We see improvement and innovation in our systems across the state, with certainly much to do. I'm confident that we will meet our goals of zero 2016 and see the end of family and youth homelessness by 2022. You know, I'm just, you know, sometimes I'm overly confident, but I do feel that we will keep the progress going and the momentum going in all that we've done. Clearly, I think that, you know, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, we are looking to other areas where we can have funding to support what we're doing in the state by, you know, working more closely with CHAFA and other, and some of the not-for-profits in looking for those opportunities, and certainly the federal government and our partners in HUD. But, you know, just in terms of our resources that we have within the department and targeting resources to address Lisa's question earlier, I think that's something, as we work together and we continue to work together, we continue to better identify what we have in our own agencies that we can bring to the table. You know, I often say we can bring the bricks and mortar dollars, okay, and invite the other folks, you know, what can you bring so that we can be successful in getting a project going. So thank you, and once again, thank you for this opportunity today.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having this forum. Thank you to the Partnership for Strong Communities. Thank you for Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, to my colleagues and dear partners in state government, and to all of you in the room who are paying attention to this very critical concern of ours. We know that families with young children experiencing homelessness are the fastest growing segment of our homeless population. And when we think about addressing this challenge, we often think about the adult side of this, and rightfully so, right? Adults they're the ones who go out and find housing, they're the ones who speak to landlords, they're the ones who need the jobs. But for those of us in early childhood, those of us who think about children on a daily basis, we know that the risk factors for those children who are going through this are so great that we cannot only focus on the adults and think about only adult solutions. So it's really great to have such strong partners here who are focusing on housing, who are focusing on health and connecting to services, partnering with parents who are in the child welfare system to make sure that they are as best capable and prepared for working with their children. But it's so important for us to do our job in OEC. So I'm going to share a little bit about what we are doing, give you kind of a context. We've heard about the statistics, and I think they're worth repeating. And then talk to you about the very low cost or no cost initiatives that we're taking on in the state to address this challenge. So as I said, we know poverty and homelessness have an adverse effect on all children and adults, really, right? We know all this. However, research is clear that earlier experiences of homelessness have a more compounding negative effect the earlier the experience is. According to a study published in Children and Youth Service Review recently in 2013, a child's age at first entry into homelessness determines additional risk for developmental delays beyond the influences of poverty. A study of more than 10,000 third graders found that children who experienced their first episode of homelessness in toddlerhood had a 60% increase in the odds of not meeting proficiency standards in math, compared to children who experienced their first episode of homelessness later in life, just a few years later in elementary school. So the earlier this happens in a child's life, the harder it is on them in their life circumstances later on. And these striking numbers are hard to ignore and are the basis for the work that we're doing in the Office of Early Childhood. And I want to echo Commissioner Klein's applause and congratulations to our governor, and real great gratitude to our governor and lieutenant governor for focusing on this and really charging all of us in his administration to take a look at this from our different vantage points. As you all know, there's a national movement afoot, right? We're talking about this right now, to end family homelessness. And a number of reports have been published recently to really charge states the federal government, localities, to shift policy, to think about this challenge differently. In fact, there was a recent study that was just published last month that I'll be talking about. I'll kind of weave this in between my comments today. It's called a qualitative assessment of parental preschool choices and challenges among families experiencing homelessness. This just came out last month. And it actually features families experiencing homelessness in Atlanta, Georgia, and right here in Connecticut, Bridgeport, Hartford, and New Haven. And so I want to use some of the words from that study to talk about what we're doing in Connecticut, specifically around what we're doing in the Office of Early Childhood as a result of the work that we launched in this very room for the Early Childhood Cabinet to focus on families with young children experiencing homelessness. And so we got together Commissioner Klein, Commissioner Bremby, Commissioner Katz, many partners in the state, and said, what can we do to address this from our different vantage points? And so what I'm going to share with you is what OEC is prepared to do, working in great partnership with the Partnership and Strong Communities, with CCEH, with United Way, to make sure that we all do our share. So here are a few things. The first is prioritizing enrollment for children experiencing homelessness in our pre-K programs. We've been doing this in a very focused way with a federal grant we have called the Preschool Development Grant. We were one of a handful of states that was lucky enough to receive this competitive grant, and we've had a really intense focus on making sure that the children who access this are not just children who are poor, but we're actually saying you need to be focusing on those who are severely poor and experiencing homelessness. And I'm happy to report that we have been able to reach families. I don't want to say the wrong amount, but I know it's been a significant number of our children in Bridgeport in particular who are homeless, who have been enrolled in this program, and I'm incredibly grateful for the work there on the ground in Bridgeport in particular. And I also want to highlight something that came out of this study. So I mentioned this study that just came out, and there was a parent talking about accessing childcare. We know that this is an incredible barrier. We saw this in the slides earlier. And it's very hard for families who are trying to find housing, trying to find a job, trying to become stable in terms of their substance abuse challenges, to then be thinking about preschool, right? But this one study said, this woman named Avery, she actually described using 211 right here in Connecticut as a referral mechanism that she used. And she says, it just shows you what's available. It tells you like what schools are available, when they have openings, and they help you get care for kids. They help you with a lot of things. This is a resource we have in this state that our agency partners with United Way to make sure that we connect families to those services. And so we're partnering with United Way to make sure that they are asking questions about homelessness, that they're really targeting those families who could benefit the most from our services. We are also focusing on making families with young children categorically eligible for our Care for Kids subsidy. This is right now going before legislation, and this will be a challenge because, as you know, this is a tight legislative session, but this is something we feel strongly is important for families, that they have access to these child care subsidy dollars, because that is a huge barrier to a family getting a job, and it's a great opportunity for a child to access high-quality care. Then it's also, another part of our charge is to identify and connect families and their young children who are homeless, right? So one thing that we have to do is actually figure out who these families are. And so we've been considering working with, using the quick risk and assets family triage, QRAFT, that DCF is already using, that they've been partnering with, where's Ann? Ann and her team at UConn, formerly where she is. So thinking about actually having more folks on the ground who are trained in using this in our child care programs, for example, to actually start to assess whether or not a family, am I echoing? There's a reverb, okay? Okay, the families who are experiencing homelessness, who are coming to our programs, that they're identified and then connected to services. We are also working to increase developmental screenings. As we mentioned earlier, families who are children, young children who experience homelessness, have higher rates of developmental delays. And so we can actually address those with our programs. We have Birth to 3 in our state. It's an incredible resource that actually takes professionals and works with children who have been identified with developmental delays. And the earlier, the better. For those of you who are in the housing world and don't think about children all the time, the statistics are very clear that if you identify a child who has a developmental delay or disability early, you can actually eliminate or dramatically decrease the need for special education later on. So making sure that our children who come to us who are experiencing homelessness have those those assessments so that we can address their needs right away. Then there's also collecting and sharing data. The partnership, CCEH, you all have been doing such amazing work, Housing, been doing such amazing work in terms of data. And so now what we are proposing, we're really prepared to do, is to start asking questions about homelessness in our early childhood information system. We just launched the first phase of that, our ECIS, and this will be a next step. This will be a later phase to actually start collecting questions about that. The debate has been, do we do it as a point in time? What's the right way to do this? We know that families move in and out of this, and how do we collect that data and have it really reflect the real experiences of the children who are in our programs? We're working on that. And then also building referral relationships and linkage capacity. We can do all we want with screening and identifying, but if we don't actually partner with the providers on the ground who can address those challenges for those families and connect them to the resources, then we've really just given information to families and nothing for them to do about those challenges. The other thing, we heard about McKinney-Vento a little bit, and for those of you, again, who are thinking about older populations, McKinney-Vento is wonderful for kids K to 12. But there's also a requirement that McKinney-Vento includes preschoolers in their count. But we know this is incredibly hard because of our mixed delivery system, the way we have early care and education across the country. Those children who are experiencing homelessness who are in pre-K or younger are often not identified. And so another proposal we are putting forward is to have all of our school readiness councils, which are across the state, actually we're requiring them to have a McKinney-Vento liaison on their council so that they will be in the mix, asking these questions, identifying where programs exist, and really thinking about the children that they are aware of who are experiencing homelessness. The other is training our program staff. It's really important, and this goes both ways, for the folks who are in shelter, who are part of the housing system, to know about all the services that we offer in the Office of Early Childhood. When you're thinking about housing, you should be thinking about housing, you should be thinking about getting your folks in TANF, but we also want you to be thinking about the babies who are sitting on the laps of the mom or the dad who are sitting there trying to get jobs, trying to get housing. And so training you all, those folks who are on the ground, to be thinking about the resources that we have in the Office of Early Childhood and be thinking about these grave statistics and the opportunity that our providers, our housing providers on the ground have to change a child's life. While you're thinking about housing, those folks, frontline staff, can be the difference between a child getting the services she needs or otherwise. And then it goes the other way, right? So thinking about our early care and education providers who have children who may be homeless, they don't even know. They have no idea because they're not even thinking about this. They're just doing the business of educating the child and getting them their snacks and nurturing them. But how are they actually identifying if a child is going through homelessness? And then what are they prepared to do? What information do they have at their disposal to connect back to the folks at the local level to make sure that they get the supports that they need? So we know that housing is the most immediate and pressing need. I'm going to give you one quick quote here. This is also from that report. She said, when they were asking about finding pre-K, this woman said, "So what did you do? Did you access pre-K? How did you go about this?" And she said, I don't know. I don't think I had the time. Between being in shelters and everything else, I wasn't really thinking about preschool. I was thinking about finding a house, a home for us. Of course, this is what a family is doing. This is the most pressing need, right? And a number of parents discussed the fact that their various moves forced them to change their children's preschools as a consequence. We know that families have crazy, I won't say insurmountable challenges, because we know in this state we are saying these are not insurmountable. These are surmountable challenges, and we're proving that. But we need to make sure that we are bringing resources to the families who are trying to do the very best for their families, stabilize their families, and we can make it easier on them by just giving them information, connecting them to resources, so that preschool, while it may be an afterthought for them, it doesn't have to be for the staff who are on the front lines working with these families. And we know this is doable. Connecticut is the state with the lowest percentage of young children under the age of 6 experiencing homelessness. This is wonderful. 1.2% of our young children under 6 are experiencing homelessness. That's compared to my beloved home state of California, where it's 1 in every 11. This is truly doable in the state, especially with the colleagues that are up here right now. But if we're not thinking about the babies, if we're not thinking about the children, we're missing an opportunity to prevent intergenerational poverty and intergenerational homelessness. So thank you so much for all the work you're doing, and I really hope you all who are on the ground don't know about the Office of Early Childhood will send me an email or reach out to us, because we have a lot to offer your providers. Thank you.
Good morning, how are you? I'm Kate McAvoy, and I'm very privileged this morning to be representing Commissioner Rod Bamby from the Department of Social Services. I want to thank Alicia and the partnership and all of the instrumental partners in the room for your incredible work on these issues. I'm very privileged to represent the department this morning. I did want to start with a brief comment invoking Commissioner Klein's remarks earlier of the opportunities we have in this policy context in Connecticut. It's an amazing point in time, an amazingly generative and a time that's full of opportunity for us, really that derives from leadership from Governor Malloy and our legislature, as well as the leadership of the departments around family system issues that have defied coordination and integration for much of our history. Commissioner Klein alluded to the opportunity costs of not examining the experience of families across departments, both from a policy perspective. We share stewardship over resources and support for people who have multiple touch points among departments of human services, our sister department of correction, and the Department of Education. And there have not been the pathways from a policy standpoint historically, nor the practical means of implementation, braiding of funding streams, and interoperability of data to enable that. But there is such practical attention and progress being made under Governor Malloy's leadership in those areas that it gives us an incredible sense of purpose, possibility, and achievement in that. So I think it is extremely important for us to remark on that. Other states are very differently situated from that standpoint of enabling mechanisms. We also have a number of focus points in policy that are all contributing to the agenda around housing stability. We talk and laud the efforts around Zero 2016, but companion pieces to that, I would submit to you, our work to optimize all of the opportunities under the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act has now enabled us to serve 750,000 individuals in Connecticut through Medicaid expansion. That's fully 1/5 of the state population. And that's an extraordinary result in and of itself with enabling access to health insurance coverage, but also that is a means of shoring people up from a standpoint of economic security in offsetting the otherwise uncovered costs, which can be very catastrophic, of acute health conditions, chronic health conditions, and the costs associated with disability where we're not able to intervene appropriately. The prevention agenda under the Affordable Care Act, the eligibility expansion, and new opportunities for individuals who, by reason of disability, require community-based long-term services and supports have all meant significant new resources and policy expansion in Connecticut that's hugely important to this discussion. Another agenda, obviously, is the Second Chance Society, examining the needs and presenting concerns of individuals who have had connection with corrections, and looking at how we enable mechanisms through housing and other types of supports to wrap around them and to ensure that we minimize to the greatest extent their reentry into that system. And also I want to call out in particular in our Medicaid lens, efforts to examine the historical phenomenon that many people with disabilities, and notably individuals with mental health disabilities and substance use disorder, principally had only institutional environments on which to rely in the Medicaid sphere. We've been involved in a governor-led long-term services and supports rebalancing agenda, multifaceted effort to examine how we help to bring people from institutional environments, integrate them in the community, and give choice and independence and self-direction using Medicaid supports, examining workforce, examining all the other elements of how we enable services in the community, along with our sister departments of human services. One of the main commonalities in each of these agendas, in Second Chance, in our ACA eligibility and prevention agenda, in long-term services and supports rebalancing, has been lack of stable, affordable, and accessible housing. That's a commonality that commends a very critical lens and a huge lever here among all of us to exert our influence. In DSS, we have a lot of opportunities here. We are an agency charged with stewarding core programs of economic support for the over 1 million individuals served by our programs and interventions. We've previously heard reference, obviously, to SNAP as a core support for food security, to the TANF program, and to Husky, all contributing instrumentally toward self-sufficiency and security. It's extremely important, I think, as we've been invited and charged to do, to examine how we are enabling access to programs. I was very conscious of Sharon's recommendations at the outset of the discussion around how we smooth that process, how we connect people easily and readily so the burden doesn't fall on them to overcome antiquated systems. And one of the most significant areas of focus for the Department of Social Services over the last several years has been replacement of our severely antiquated eligibility management system and development of integrated processes that have started with coordination and partnership with our state health insurance exchange, Access Health, but are slated to amplify across departments of human services to recognize that there's a common nexus amongst agencies in terms of affording access to programs. We also have to make sure that the service array recognizes and responds and is adequate to support individuals who are served by our departments, and notably in the Department of Social Services, that has meant under the Affordable Care Act, very significant expansion of the preventive services agenda around primary care supports through enabling of reimbursement increases for providers, development of a person-centered medical home initiative. We have expanded the covered services in Medicaid, very robust behavioral health benefit, especially compared to other states, dental benefit, but also services and supports that, it may surprise you, were never covered historically, like smoking cessation, around overall health status. But we have to also examine, as we look at the health supports in and of themselves, and this is, I think, a dawning recognition at long last for Medicaid directors, people can't engage with their health outcomes, their desired improvements and maintenance of health status unless they have housing stability. And I think that is a great motivator for Medicaid directors across the country, for me, for the commissioner, in looking at Medicaid as a set of authorities and a funding mechanism that can be now elastically applied to some of these perennial challenges that we've had about sustainability of funding and ensuring permanency for people. I'd like to wind up by talking about some of the ways in which that new attention on social determinants and mostly on housing is crystallizing. This goes to the question of what are we doing as departments to coordinate, and how are we looking at the issue of how funding constraints can be addressed in the present landscape. Very excitingly, the state of Connecticut, representing a multidisciplinary work team composed of representatives from Commissioner Klein's Department of Housing, from the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, DSS, OPM, and then also in conjunction with our community partners, like the Partnership for Strong Communities, have joined together, in addition to the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, to apply for a very important new technical assistance opportunity that was issued by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. It's called the Innovation Accelerator Program. CMS is charged under this opportunity, states coming together and overcoming those historical barriers across departments, addressing the need to examine how we use Medicaid authority to pay for transition supports for individuals who are moving from institutional settings to the community, and also tenancy sustaining supports. The supportive housing agenda that has been abundantly demonstrated by the Department of Housing, by the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, and DCF, as having been an instrumental support, the fulcrum point of maintaining stability and security in the community. How do we address that through the new elasticity we have in Medicaid authority to cover those supports? The Innovation Accelerator Program, or IAP, we were selected competitively from a field of almost all states. We're one of 8 states to participate in this over the next 12 months. This says, really, let's get down to brass tacks. Let's come together with what we already have in the way of resources. Let's talk about how to braid those to achieve outcomes. Let's talk about how we improve data interoperability so we don't have to individually transact data agreements each and every time we want to do that. We're very proud at DSS to have done matching of HMIS data with Medicaid data, but it's a hard process and can be slow. So how do we achieve that so there's better interoperability across all departments that have touch on this, as have done states like Washington that are far ahead of us and really provide great models. So in summary, we have, I think, a fantastic and generative policy environment within which to work under the governor's leadership. We have new opportunities through federal funding, especially from my lens in the Affordable Care Act, but not unique to that. And we have a crystallizing opportunity through this technical assistance chance we have, the Innovation Accelerator, to develop an applied plan to make all of the goodwill and philosophic agreement around this issue yield intangible results. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Duryea, and I am here representing Commissioner Joette Katz from the Department of Children and Families, who sends her regrets for not being able to be here today, but I have to say that I feel very lucky to have the benefit of coming and speaking and being part of this panel. It's always nice when, in spite of the current fiscal climate and landscape, that you can come to something like this, take time out of your day and really hear, at least on the agency level, that there remains to be a lot of optimism around the good work that's happening in Connecticut and all of the opportunities that we have in terms of where we want to focus our efforts going forward. I'm going to just adjust a couple of my comments because there has been a lot of focus on the supportive housing for families work that's happening, and take a few minutes to just talk about this concept of prevention that you've heard a few of the speakers talk about, because I think for anyone working at the Department of Children and Families, the concept of prevention means something very different. And I also want to just call out where I see these partnerships and collaborations really yielding very tangible opportunities and results across the agencies, and really for the benefit of the residents of the state of Connecticut. But I think the key theme for us is that there really is no one solution, and we need to look across the range of models and interventions and opportunities within each agency if we're really going to truly end family homelessness. So beginning with the department, I recognize that to have all of you in this room coalesced around the issue of ending family homelessness, we wouldn't be here but for people who are able to bring us together and convene us as a group. So the partnership and the coalition obviously can really play a critical role in availing space for us to have these conversations. But the panel has highlighted, I think, this concept of prevention, and for the Department of Children and Families, that concept is really around preventing families from coming to the attention of DCF. So I know that I am one of many across the department that really take that part of our statutory mandate very seriously, and that if you look at the shifts that we've made in our policy and practice changes over the course of this administration with the support of the governor, with the support of the sister human service agencies which serve so many of our families, and just the practice shifts that we've made in really trying to keep kids with families wherever possible. And two areas that you've heard hit on and touched on over the course of the morning are really around this common theme with housing. I also want to underscore the importance of having quality evidence-based substance use interventions for families as well, because we know for the families that are served by DCF that on average, and Sharon's data really hit on this morning, that the touch points that these families have with so many human service systems are many. The national data, and this was data that when Brian Samuels was commissioner of the U.S. Administration for Children and Families, that national profile reflects that on average child welfare families touch as many as 8 systems. And so if you think of the inefficiency across government agencies, if we're each availing services and we're not doing that in concert with one another, that in and of itself is reason for us to just take pause and think about how can we do a better job, because just for families having to navigate all of those systems in and of itself, even if they're funded at optimal levels, is problematic. The range of housing solutions, I think, is something that we at the department, we benefit from the work that each of these agencies that's up here and other agencies who are not necessarily represented on the panel, we benefit from the work that the advocates are doing, the partnership and the coalition to really highlight the issues that are impacting family homelessness. I think that, you think about the foster care system, and we hear so much about youth transitioning out of the foster care system, and how our system really puts kids at risk for a whole host of disparate outcomes longitudinally. And I really am always very inspired to hear Kate talk about the data and the research around cost benefit. That is really one of the strategies that government needs to do a better job of is funding that longitudinal those longitudinal types of studies and research, and obviously the work that UConn's doing, the work that Chapin Hall has done. Chapin Hall has a great study that talks about the disparate impact or the disparate outcomes that kids experience when they're transitioning out of foster care. And that's multi-generational because we know that we're serving not just the kids in foster care, but we're trying to serve the parents if we're trying to keep families together, or if we're trying to reunify kids with their families once taking them into care. But we also know that kids transitioning from foster care are at greater risk for justice involvement, either in the juvenile justice side or the criminal justice side. They face greater rates of unemployment. They experience substance use and other behavioral health disorders, and they generate a lot of costs to society and costs to government that we need to do a better job of. And so when we have those data, when we're able to bring these analyses from our research partners, that is a way in which we in government can go to funders, to OPM, to the legislature and say, this is what we know works and this is where we need to make investments, and help inform our decisions around where we're funding programs. I also want to call out the fact that in addition to the state agencies and the advocates shining a light on these issues, we wouldn't be where we are within the department without the providers, and that is where just specifically highlighting the work that the Connection has done with the department around the supportive housing for families model, and then being part of our grant to the U.S. Administration for Children and Families. So that's a $5 million grant. We're currently in year 4, but we've already learned so much. It's really very frustrating when you have a grant and it's working, and you want to scale it up. And we know that while through the supportive housing model and the intensive supportive housing for families model and the comparison that's being done, we've got a wait list of over 700 families, and that's just in the limited areas of the state in which we have those programs. And so again, I think that speaks and underscores that we have tremendous unmet need related to housing across the state. I also think that one of the opportunities that we have within the department is thinking about, we have this federal grant. I do think grants are a great opportunity for us in government to become smarter, to evolve, to learn from the data. But I also think that the technical assistance is also a critical area, and that's where the collaboration that we can build upon within this room, but looking at what other states have done. And I've had the benefit of going to a couple of different conferences with some of my co-panelists, and I look at Kate and Commissioner Jones-Taylor. There's a lot of work being done around the country that I think Connecticut does not have to reinvent the wheel. So if you look at some of the work that's being done around the 2-generational models, and that's exactly what we're talking about when you talk about the families that we're looking to serve more in Connecticut, by addressing the needs around housing instability and substance use, we can help afford opportunities for parents to get access to services that address trauma in the family, for services that help to provide stable housing and build the resilience of the family so that they're not involved with the child welfare system any longer than they need to be. And I know I speak unanimously for everyone at the department that that is ultimately our goal. The 2-generational models, I also think, have given us an opportunity to think about what are the policy and practice implications. So the QRAF tool is, sort of a pilot, and again, another plug for grants and going after these. They're always a worthy investment of time in terms of building partnership and collaboration across the government agencies, but I also think it gives you a great opportunity to think about, how are we screening and referring families for services? And we within the department struggle. We provide housing and substance use and behavioral health and a whole slew of other services. And in fact, we don't necessarily do that on a consistent basis because a lot of that is based upon the limitations we have within our service array or the limitations we have in certain parts of the state with our provider communities. So where we can call that out and share that with all of the stakeholders, you here in the room, but also many others, we think that will really help us to inform and make better decisions in a number of areas. I also want to just call out the technical assistance that we as a state received through our participation as a 3-branch institute site with support from the governor through the National Governors Association. We were selected to participate in 2013 in a 3-branch initiative which was intended to forge a group of leaders across not just government and the branches, but really getting people invested and having the advocates and the providers and families and children be part of shaping what is our collective agenda around improving the well-being for Connecticut's children. And it was a very broad and sweeping vision, but what it yielded was a pretty strong common agenda or development of some common themes around where we struggle with well-being outcomes, and housing was at the top of the list. And so we really made some diligent efforts to work with the Children's Committee and other legislators. The other areas that we focused on were around behavioral health and permanency for kids, so those are very, in some respects, very child welfare centric, but these were areas where we know that we're serving the families that everyone in this room has a vested interest in serving better and improving their outcomes. So with respect to the other partnership and collaboration, my fellow panelists have touched on a lot of the ongoing collaboration. We're doing a lot with the Department of Housing and looking at ways in which we can repurpose some state-owned facilities and seeing if there's opportunities to put in place supportive housing for families, in various places around the state. Supporting the work the OEC is doing in so many ways, and I've had many conversations with Commissioner Jones-Taylor where I've said, hey, if you guys get what you want, that's only going to help us down the road. So they've been a wonderful partner as well. And DSS and the work that Kate is doing, Kate is probably one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. So, and I love listening to her talk, so I was sort of geeking out earlier when I got to hear her remarks. But the work that they're doing around Medicaid is really profound, and I think it is really shifting the culture within Connecticut and on the national level, because there are a lot of eyes on us, which is always a great validation of what we're doing well. We've got a long way to go, but we're doing a lot of things well. And trust me when I say that it's really hard to feel optimistic in spite of the budget and in spite of, being in the middle of a legislative session and in spite of the fact that the world of child welfare is not rosy. And how do we keep going? And really it is about thinking about ways in which we can make improvements to the system. So recommendations I have, I've touched on a couple of them, or you've heard about them from other panelists. This notion of interoperability. I'm a lawyer by training, so things like HIPAA and FERPA and confidentiality laws scare me a little bit. So we do need to work through the mechanics of some of the legal barriers to data sharing. But I do think it can be done, and I think it can be done really effectively when we have people like Kate and Yukon and Ann and Chapin Hall, and where we can tap those resources, because that's not something government ever funds. Here we are talking about which programs we're going to cut, where we're going to cut services, and we cannot, in good faith, then turn around and go to the legislature and say, oh, we need, X hundred of $1,000s to invest in our data infrastructure to build, this mega data sharing system like they have in the state of Washington, which is phenomenal, by the way, but they have a Gates Foundation, and sadly we don't. So if we did have a Gates Foundation, that would be an optimal goal to promote greater interoperability between government agencies. I mentioned grants, I mentioned technical assistance. I think that those are ways in which we can see an evolving legislative agenda come forth, one that is supported between both government agencies, the providers, the advocates, and families and children that we're serving. Oftentimes, with the best of intentions, legislation passes or legislation stays on the books for a really, really long time without, an opportunity to reevaluate that. So I think that some of the grants and the technical assistance and the partnerships have really begun to sort of drill down to that level, which is encouraging. And really what I would also just focus on is the need to build our evidence-based practice, because all too often this is something we deal with at DCF, where we have dollars and where we know we have an immediate need. We will fund things that we don't know work, and we don't necessarily take advantage of the rich array of evidence-based models that we have at our fingertips within the state and again nationally. So I would just encourage everybody to keep their chin up and think broadly about how do we want to move this forward. And thank you for allowing me to be part of the panel today.
So I will try to be brief, but I have the privilege of being here today and representing not only the service providers in the community, but those who literally experience homelessness. And thank you for having me on the panel. We've kind of covered a lot of things, and so I'll try to scale back my comments. But one of the things I'd really like to point out is sort of how everything that people spoke about today sort of plays out with a family in a shelter. So briefly, let me tell you how things have sort of changed in the shelter world. I think initially we believed that we could be the best, and all of my peers feel this way, where we thought, we could get the right kinds of services and the right kinds of people together, and we would be the smartest at solving these problems. And so in-house, while people were homeless and in shelter, we would provide all kinds of great services and wonderful access to things, and we would determine when a person was housing ready and ready to sort of leave us. And this is more prevalent in family shelter than individual shelter. But thankfully, we've made a shift where we no longer think of ourselves as people who will determine when somebody is housing ready, and we've moved to thinking about housing first. So the goal has been to be able to take those rich array of services and support systems and move them from a shelter environment to follow the person wherever they go. So instead of building these robust shelters that can provide these services that in some ways inhibit a family's ability to sort of move ahead, can we take these same types of services and follow the family to transitional housing, to a permanent housing situation, to a rapid rehousing situation, and see them thrive in an environment that already lends itself to more success? So I've been fortunate to be able to work in an environment, even though my shelter is 30 years old, that has been able to adapt over time. So what we've seen is that Once you start to look at it on that macro level, you can start to mine the micro data. And there is where you figure out families that are resilient versus families that maybe are not as resilient. Who responds well to opportunity and who is still struggling with opportunity. And rapid rehousing has given us an excellent opportunity to do that. Some people get into a new place to live with very little support and very little help, and they're on their way, they don't revisit the system. Others are timid, maybe it's trauma-informed, but they definitely have more trouble accessing those things and staying stabilized. So what is the difference? And I think as we start to solve some of these larger system issues, we can start to really look at those individual issues and figure out how we can better use resources to support those who maybe don't have a natural core of resiliency. So a couple of things I wanted to mention quickly is how have we been able to change things on the sort of community level, and how have we been able to benefit from the support that we have from the agencies that are represented here today and some that aren't, DMIS and a few others. So one of the things that we really were fortunate to do is to come together as communities in a different way than we have in the past, through coordinated access and through the use of 211 as sort of the gateway into people getting services. By doing this, what we've been able to do is really see our partners in our communities as true collaborators. There's no longer a defined client of mine, a defined client of another agency. We see them as a group of people in need, and we are a group of people who can solve these problems. So through that access, through 211, one coordinated way of people getting in, one list of people who need help, we're able to better just tackle the issue. And what we've been able to do in our, and I represent Fairfield County, in our county we've been able to significantly reduce our chronic homeless numbers, our family homeless numbers, our veteran homeless numbers in a way that's really unprecedented. So sharing information in that way has been critical, and we talked a little bit about data sharing and how to make that possible. But once you do, and once you have that data, it's incredible how much faster you can come up with systems that work. For example, matching meetings where together people from different agencies will sit and say, these are the next most vulnerable people on our list. These are the housing units that we have available. Who matches with what? Let's move on. Let's get people housed. And let's transition the services to the housing and the community instead of keeping them in-house. So that's been really a victory for us, I think. So if I could back up a minute to sort of how our shelter works and how each of these agencies really informs how we work. When somebody comes into shelter with us, we immediately start to work on a couple of key items. The first one is connecting to family, friends, and community. Community for families is a big question. It's the schools, it's the child care, it's all kinds of transportation issues and things like that. So connecting to community is a critical component, and many of these agencies are part of that. The next step is looking at mental health and physical health. So that includes everything from substance use, mental health support, recognizing if there are learning or developmental disabilities that are holding back a family from moving forward, recognizing that the children may be suffering from trauma, all of that, and then paying attention to medical health. Are you seeing doctors regularly? Are you using community health centers? All these resources, these rich array of resources that are so hard to connect people to. So in some way, we become that connector. The next thing is really looking at increasing income through benefits and employment, and then looking at people being work ready or getting out to work. So that's including workforce development and all of those components, private industry, and then lastly, getting housing ready and finding housing. So over the years, we've kind of collapsed those sort of silos, and we recognize that we need to do those things faster and better, and sometimes we're doing it in the shelter environment, sometimes we're doing it in the individual's home environment, but those key components, which are so dependent on having the right resources at the agency level trickling down to the community, need to be stitched together however it works for that individual family. So we're happy to hear that there's more collaboration on this end, and we hope that the information that we provide over time can inform ways where we can start to push the boundaries on criteria. Some programs only work for people in shelter, some work only for people who are out of shelter, but start to look at how we can kind of recognize that people are fluid and that services need to be fluid also. And so it's a pleasure for me to be here today. I had a lot to say, but I know the time is up, so thank you very much for hearing me.
So what's exciting, I think, about what we've just heard from our panelists are a few themes that I think resonate with this audience. What we've heard is the recognition that housing is critically important for the lives of those who are experiencing homelessness, including children and babies. We understand collectively, and many thanks to Sharon and Kate for drawing out the data that helps us understand the significant cost that we are incurring as a state when we fail to resolve the homelessness of those families. And what we've heard, I think, is that we are lucky in Connecticut to have state agencies that are already moving forward, as Yvonne said, to break down silos, as Myra has pointed out, to coordinate better with each other and with the nonprofits, as Kate pointed out, to explore innovation in terms of what more we can do with Medicaid, including to serve families, and what Elizabeth has said, to draw together the strands from DCF through our homelessness system. And we are always grateful to the nonprofit providers on the ground who are doing so much of the work, including on behalf of their state funders. With those themes in mind, are there questions? We have a few minutes for questions.
If you could expand on something I've been very interested in as a model is linking at coordinated entry and with rapid rehousing home visitation services for early childhood development, maybe particularly because families are so mobile that it just seems ideally suited. Have you done any work here? What's the progress?
Can you speak to Myra?
Oh, is it on? Yeah. I'm so glad you asked because I was wincing after my comments. I realized I did not call out home visiting. I called out our Birth to 3 system, which is part of home visiting, and our early care and education. So yes, we actually have, we've been working in a very focused way with our home visitors and our Birth to 3 providers who are also in the home with families, those children who have disabilities, to make sure that a child receives the services that she needs or he needs, even if in shelter. So going to shelter to provide services, going to some other public place to provide services, home visiting. So for those of you who don't know, home visitors come into, they partner with families, our most, our overburdened and under-resourced families who present with a lot of risk factors for things we would really like to avoid. They work with families to prevent child abuse. We know that families who are experiencing trauma, overburdened, there's a higher prevalence of that, unfortunately. Also just work with them in parenting and getting them jobs and getting them housing, getting them all kinds of supports that they need to be successful as adults and as parents. And so that's certainly part of the work that we're doing with the cabinet work. I don't know if you want more details, I can follow up with you. But yeah, there's a huge opportunity there because they are in the home and they are seeing some of our most overburdened and under-resourced families.
It's really just a general question to anybody. I'm wondering, do any of the speakers or presenters feel as if the private sector has a stake in ending homelessness? And if they do, what exactly would that be? Is that plausible? Does that resonate with anybody?
Yvonne, you look like you want to respond to that.
Well, I think it's an interesting question because certainly as we travel across the state to talk about affordable housing, oftentimes it isn't met with open arms. I'll be frank. Mm-hmm. But absolutely, the private sector is the sector that we hear the most from about the high cost of everything, right? So I think, the financial argument, I always think about the audience and who, and what arguments we need to make. Certainly the private sector, there is a financial argument to be made in given their investments. And those critical investments. So, and I also think that there's a tremendous opportunity there for the private sector.
And just to follow up on that as well, there's significant interest we have found at the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness among the private sector in the question of how to help divert families from shelter. That is, how to help them at the front door so that they don't have to come into shelter and then go into this terrible downslide of homelessness. ESPN has been supportive of our efforts through something we call the Be Homeful Fund, where we're trying to leverage private investment to help our shelter providers across the state have a pool of resources to help those families at the front door. So ESPN, WTNH, among others, have been very interested in that. And for anyone who'd like to look into that and think about your community, I hope you'll look for that, behomeful.org. We're conscious that state resources are constrained, and we do need to call on private citizens and private businesses to be part of the solution.
And I was just going to add that in addition to the funding that we receive from some of the state agencies, that it's really like a third of what we need to operate. So we're constantly going out to the private sector to look for funding. And with that gives an opportunity to educate them on why this is important. And so some of the presentations earlier were so useful because return on investment and understanding the cost of not doing something about homelessness really makes the point. Then secondly, I mentioned just briefly that opening up your eyes and opening up your doors to hiring people who are non-traditional employees is a critical thing that business owners can do. And then on the small business level, it's kind of reminding people that a community is only healthy when everyone in the community is healthy. And so for small business owners, they tend to understand that better because it's not good for business to have people out on the street struggling while they're trying to conduct, a positive work environment. So I think in all three of those levels, I think there's a lot that we can do, and they are partners willingly or unwillingly in many ways.
If I could just add one quick comment, just tie those two comments together. I mean, if you think about return on investment, you think about, the financial argument, and then tying it back to Dr. Parr's work, I can't wait to dig into that data. I mean, that's pretty compelling, right? It's pretty compelling thank you, $122,000 a year. I mean, that, I think, bottom line for the private side who's, concerned about increasing costs, people who are interested in return on investment, I mean, you throw that number out, it's pretty clear that there's an interest across the board for all of us as citizens of this state.
If you'd, I'm so sorry. We're going to wrap up. I'm being told we're out of time, but I think the panelists might be willing to stay for a moment. If you would join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us all morning and for being here today. Please feel free to contact us in the coming weeks about the progress of the Family Economic Security Work Group. For those of you who RSVP to the invitation for the policy luncheon, we'll be right across the way, and we'll be convening there shortly. And for those who are looking for materials, they'll all be posted on our website in the coming days. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.